The air over the contested borders of Western Europe in the autumn of 1944 was heavy with the smell of diesel exhaust, damp earth, and the pervasive metallic friction of industrial warfare. Within the command bunkers and armored half-tracks of the elite German panzer divisions, a profound and terrifying realization was beginning to crystallize among the veteran officers of the Wehrmacht. For years, these men had been the undisputed masters of mechanized combat, having forged their tactical doctrines in the sweeping blitzkriegs of Poland and France and honed them in the limitless, brutal expanses of the Russian steppes. They commanded machines that were widely considered the apex predators of the battlefield: the heavily armored Tiger and the technologically advanced Panther, equipped with thick sloped glacis plates and devastating high-velocity cannons. They subscribed to a martial philosophy that prized the individual duel, the decisive armored clash where superior metallurgy and long-range gunnery would inevitably triumph. Yet as they engaged the advancing columns of the United States Army, they found their magnificent machines and their carefully cultivated combat doctrines being systematically dismantled by an adversary that fought an entirely different kind of war. The German commanders were forced to confront the chilling reality that the American armored forces did not wage war as a collection of individual tanks seeking heroic combat, but as an incredibly dense, hyper-aggressive, and fully integrated mechanized organism. The tactics employed by the United States armored divisions did not rely on the armor thickness of a single vehicle, but rather on a revolutionary application of mobility, relentless communication, overwhelming combined arms integration, and a logistical momentum that simply crushed the German ability to react. To comprehend the tactical nightmare that the American armored divisions presented to the German military, one must first discard the post-war mythology that characterized the American M4 Sherman as a fundamentally flawed vehicle that only achieved victory through crude numerical superiority. This oversimplified narrative entirely ignores the profound technical and ergonomic realities that governed armored warfare in the mid-20th century. When a German tank commander looked through the Zeiss optics of his Panther tank, he saw a machine built for the specific purpose of destroying other tanks at extreme ranges. The Panther was a defensive sniper, a heavy complex platform that excelled when sitting stationary behind a hedgerow or on a distant ridge. However, the American military planners observing the early years of the war had designed the Sherman not as a static sniper but as a weapon of fluid exploitation. The Sherman was an offensive machine designed to exploit breakthroughs, disrupt enemy rear areas, and maintain a continuous operational tempo that the German heavy tanks simply could not match. The American tactical doctrine explicitly stated that enemy tanks were the primary responsibility of dedicated tank destroyer battalions and concentrated artillery, while the armored divisions were meant to bypass strongpoints and wreak havoc on the enemy command and supply structures. But when tank-on-tank engagements inevitably occurred, the American crews utilized the specific mechanical advantages of the Sherman to inflict devastating localized defeats upon the heavier German armor. The most terrifying tactical advantage possessed by the American tank crews was their unparalleled speed of target acquisition and turret traverse. In the chaotic close-quarters environments of the Normandy bocage, the dense forests of the Ardennes, and the ruined urban landscapes of Germany, armored engagements were rarely fought at the extreme ranges favored by the German guns. Instead, they were vicious sudden encounters at ranges of a few hundred yards or less, where the first tank to identify the enemy and fire an accurate shot almost always emerged victorious. The American Sherman was equipped with an advanced hydraulic turret traverse mechanism that was completely independent of the tank's engine speed. An American gunner could rotate his turret a full 360 degrees in less than 15 seconds smoothly and precisely, laying his crosshairs onto a target the moment it appeared. By stark contrast, the hydraulic traverse of the German Panther was mechanically linked to its complex Maybach engine. If a Panther was moving slowly to conserve fuel or sitting at idle, its turret rotated at a dangerously sluggish pace, often taking over a minute to complete a full circle. If a Panther commander wanted to traverse his turret quickly, he had to order his driver to rev the engine to maximum revolutions, a process that took precious seconds, and announce the tank's exact position with a roar of mechanical noise and a plume of blue exhaust smoke. In the lethal mathematics of a meeting engagement, this discrepancy was fatal. The American crews, utilizing their superior ergonomics, would routinely acquire track and engage a German tank before the German gunner could even bring his heavy weapon to bear. This speed of engagement was further amplified by a piece of American analog technology that the German military intelligence deeply misunderstood and severely underestimated: the Westinghouse gyrostabilizer. The Sherman was the first mass-produced tank in history to feature an electromechanical gyroscopic stabilization system for its main gun. The system stabilized the 75mm weapon in the vertical plane, counteracting the pitching and rolling of the tank as it moved over uneven terrain. While the gyrostabilizer was not advanced enough to allow American crews to consistently hit small targets while driving at their maximum speed of 25 miles per hour, it provided a massive tactical advantage that American commanders ruthlessly exploited. The American tactical doctrine known as the short halt dictated that an advancing Sherman upon spotting an enemy would brake aggressively to a momentary stop, fire a precisely aimed round and immediately accelerate again before the enemy could return fire. Because the gyrostabilizer kept the gun generally laid on the target during the deceleration phase, the American gunner did not have to waste precious seconds manually reacquiring his sight picture after the tank came to a halt. He simply made a micro-adjustment and fired immediately. German veteran tank commanders accustomed to the rhythmic, predictable stops required by Soviet and British tanks were repeatedly stunned by the sheer velocity of the American engagement cycle. They reported facing an enemy that seemed to fire accurately while still in motion, delivering high explosive and armor-piercing shells with a robotic fluidity that shattered the traditional tempo of armored duels. But the terror inflicted by the American armored forces extended far beyond the mechanical capabilities of a single Sherman tank. The true genius of the United States military and the factor that completely paralyzed the German defensive mindset was the absolute mastery of integrated radio communications. The American Army was the most radio-dense combat force on the planet. While the German armored formations struggled with chronic shortages of fragile vacuum tubes and copper wire, often equipping only the platoon commander's tank with a full transmitter and receiver while the subordinate tanks carried only receivers, the American industrial base flooded the European theater with hundreds of thousands of highly reliable frequency-modulated radios. Every single American Sherman tank was equipped with an SCR 508 or an SCR 528 radio set, allowing for continuous crystal-clear two-way communication between every vehicle in a platoon, every platoon in a company, and every company in a battalion. This technological omnipresence transformed an American armored column from a collection of isolated vehicles into a highly synchronized hive mind of destruction. When a German anti-tank gun concealed in a tree line opened fire on an American armored patrol, it might succeed in disabling the lead vehicle. In previous years of the war against different adversaries, such an ambush would often cause confusion and delay as the surviving tanks struggled to identify the source of the fire using flags or hand signals. But when engaging the Americans, the German gunners experienced an immediate and terrifying coordinated response. The surviving American tank commanders instantly keyed their microphones, broadcasting the exact compass bearing, range, and description of the hidden German position to every other tank in the formation. Within seconds, the entire American column would maneuver aggressively, using the terrain to mask their movements while simultaneously snapping their hydraulically driven turrets toward the threat. The American response was not a series of individual reactions but a perfectly orchestrated mechanical swarm. The Sherman tanks would utilize their high rate of fire, pumping up to 20 rounds per minute of high explosive and white phosphorus smoke shells into the tree line, blinding the German gunners and systematically dismantling their defensive position before they could even reload their weapons. The German infantry and anti-tank crews who survived these encounters reported that engaging an American armored column felt like kicking a hornet's nest. The localized superiority of the American communications network meant that the German element of surprise was instantly negated and punished with an overwhelming, mathematically precise application of high explosive violence. This continuous radio chatter was not limited merely to tank-to-tank communication. The most devastating aspect of the American armored doctrine was its seamless integration with the field artillery network. The United States military did not view the tank as an independent weapon system but as the armored tip of a massive logistical and artillery spear. American armored divisions were supported by organic battalions of highly mobile M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers and towed 155mm guns. The communication link between the frontline Sherman tanks and these artillery batteries was instantaneous and universally accessible. Any American tank commander possessing a map and a compass could act as a forward observer. If an American armored thrust encountered a heavy concentration of German armor or a fortified village that could not be bypassed, the lead tanks did not attempt a suicidal frontal assault. They simply halted, reversed into hull-down positions behind the nearest ridge line, and picked up the radio handset. The German defenders waiting for the American tanks to blunder into their carefully prepared kill zones would instead experience the sudden apocalyptic arrival of American artillery fire. The American fire direction centers, utilizing sophisticated analog computers and pre-calculated firing tables, could process a call for fire from a frontline tank commander and deliver a devastating barrage within minutes. Furthermore, the Americans had perfected the concept of the time on target or top barrage. By carefully calculating the flight times of artillery shells from dozens of different batteries scattered across the operational sector, the American commanders could synchronize the firing sequences so that hundreds of high-explosive shells traveling from different distances and different trajectories would all impact the target coordinate at the exact same fraction of a second. For the German panzer grenadiers and tank crews massed for a counterattack, the result was a sudden, incomprehensible earthquake of violence that arrived entirely without the traditional warning of ranging shots. Entire German armored staging areas were vaporized in a single blinding instant of overlapping shockwaves and razor-sharp shrapnel. The psychological impact of knowing that any American tank, no matter how small or seemingly isolated, possessed the invisible power to call down the wrath of heaven at a moment's notice completely paralyzed the German tactical initiative. They realized that they were not fighting a tank, they were fighting the entire industrial and mathematical might of the United States Artillery Corps channeled through a single radio antenna. This horizontal integration of firepower extended upward into the very atmosphere. As the Allied forces achieved absolute air supremacy over Western Europe, the American armored divisions began to perfect the complex art of close air support. American armored columns were assigned dedicated air liaison officers who rode in specially modified half-tracks or tanks equipped with highly sensitive, very high-frequency radios that could communicate directly with the squadrons of P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang fighter bombers circling continuously overhead in a system known as the cab rank. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a particularly terrifying instrument of aerial interdiction. Powered by a massive Pratt & Whitney radial engine and armed with 850 caliber heavy machine guns and racks of high-velocity 5-inch rockets, it was essentially a flying tank destroyer. When an American armored column encountered a heavy German Panther or Tiger tank that their 75mm guns could not easily penetrate from the front, they simply popped a specific colored smoke grenade to mark the target and radioed the overhead cab rank. The German heavy tank crews, who believed their thick frontal armor made them invincible, found themselves subjected to a terrifying vertical assault. The Thunderbolts would peel out of the clouds, entering a steep dive, and unleash a salvo of rockets that struck with the kinetic energy of a naval destroyer. The rockets did not need to penetrate the thickest armor of the German tanks. A near miss or a strike on the thinner top armor of the turret or engine deck was more than sufficient to shatter the transmission, ignite the volatile aviation fuel, or completely obliterate the running gear. The roar of the radial engines and the terrifying shriek of the diving aircraft forced the German armored columns to operate in a state of constant paranoia. They were forced to cover their vehicles in heavy foliage, restrict their movements exclusively to nighttime hours or inclement weather, and abandon the open roads entirely. The vaunted mobility of the panzer divisions, the very foundation of the Blitzkrieg doctrine, was permanently stripped away by the ever-present threat of the American fighter bombers directed by the vanguard of the American armored columns. The physical reality of the American Sherman tank also defied the German expectations of armored combat. While the Sherman did not possess the extreme armor thickness of the German heavy tanks, it was designed with a profound focus on crew survivability, mechanical reliability, and rapid repair. The American engineers understood that in a total industrial war, tanks would inevitably be destroyed, but highly trained veteran crews were irreplaceable. The Sherman was designed with numerous escape hatches, allowing the crew to rapidly evacuate a burning vehicle. Furthermore, late-model Shermans were equipped with wet stowage systems for their main gun ammunition surrounding the volatile powder casings, with jackets filled with water and ethylene glycol. This dramatically reduced the catastrophic ammunition fires that plagued earlier models and allowed the vast majority of American crews to survive armor penetrations. The German tank crews, by contrast, operating in the cramped, over-engineered interiors of the Panthers and Tigers, faced a much higher mortality rate when their vehicles were compromised. The German military was hemorrhaging its most experienced veterans, while the American crews were surviving their initial combat encounters, learning from their mistakes, and returning to the front lines in replacement vehicles within days. This seamless replacement of combat losses was driven by a logistical juggernaut that completely baffled the German high command. The United States Army approached armored warfare as a massive, continuous industrial process. Behind every advancing American armored division stretched an unbroken conveyor belt of supply extending all the way back to the manufacturing plants in Detroit and Ohio. The American logistical network, utilizing massive fleets of cargo trucks in systems like the famous Red Ball Express, ensured that the frontline Sherman tanks were constantly supplied with high-octane fuel, hundreds of thousands of rounds of ammunition and spare parts. When an American tank was damaged in combat or suffered a mechanical failure, it was not simply abandoned on the side of the road. Massive armored recovery vehicles like the M25 Dragon Wagon would brave enemy fire to retrieve the damaged Sherman, towing it back to highly organized mobile maintenance battalions. These battalions, equipped with heavy cranes, welding equipment, and vast inventories of spare parts, functioned as fully operational mobile factories capable of replacing an entire tank engine or swapping a destroyed turret in a matter of hours. The German logistical situation in the autumn of 1944 was a study in absolute systemic collapse. The German manufacturing centers were being systematically leveled by the Allied strategic bombing campaigns, and their rail networks were in ruins. The highly complex German tanks, requiring rare alloys and precision machining, could not be produced in sufficient numbers to replace combat losses. Furthermore, the tanks they did manage to produce were rushed to the front lines with severe mechanical defects. The Panther tank, for example, was notoriously plagued by a catastrophic design flaw in its final drive gears. Because the tank was significantly heavier than its original design parameters, the transmission simply could not handle the immense torque required to maneuver the 45-ton vehicle over rough terrain. German tank commanders were strictly ordered to avoid pivoting their tanks in place or executing sharp turns, lest their final drives shatter, rendering the vehicle completely immobile. When a German tank broke down, there were no heavy recovery vehicles available to tow it back and no spare parts to fix it. The crew was forced to drain the fluids, place an explosive charge in the breech of the main gun, and abandon their incredibly expensive piece of military hardware simply because of a broken gear. The American armored divisions ruthlessly exploited this German lack of strategic depth and mechanical reliability. The American tactical doctrine emphasized continuous, relentless pressure. They realized that the German panzer divisions possessed immense localized combat power but lacked the logistical endurance to sustain a prolonged fluid engagement. The American armored thrusts were designed to keep the German forces constantly off balance, forcing them to react, maneuver, and burn their precious reserves of fuel and ammunition. An American armored combat command would attack a German position, force the defenders to commit their heavy reserves, and then immediately disengage, using their superior automotive speed to flank the German position and strike deeper into the rear areas. The German commanders, attempting to organize a coherent defensive line, found their command posts overrun, their supply lines severed, and their heavy tanks outflanked by an enemy that simply refused to fight on their rigid tactical terms. The Americans treated the battlefield not as a static chessboard but as a fluid, dynamic environment where speed, communication, and logistical endurance were the ultimate arbiters of victory. This terrifying reality was demonstrated with brutal clarity during the massive armored clashes in the Lorraine region, particularly the Battle of Arracourt in September of 1944. The German High Command ordered a massive armored counteroffensive utilizing several newly formed panzer brigades equipped with brand new factory-fresh Panther tanks. Their objective was to smash into the flank of General George Patton's advancing Third Army and sever its supply lines. On paper, the German formations possessed overwhelming technical superiority, heavily armored Panthers facing lighter American Shermans. But the engagement unfolded as a systematic, localized slaughter of the German forces. The American forces belonging to the 4th Armored Division utilized the rolling, foggy terrain to their absolute advantage. They did not engage in long-range gunnery duels. Instead, they used their highly reliable radios to coordinate complex flanking maneuvers. The American Sherman tanks would remain hidden in the morning mist, utilizing their superior turret traverse and Euro stabilizers to snap off precise armor-piercing shots into the thin side armor of the advancing Panthers. When the fog lifted, the American tactical air support arrived, dropping high explosives directly onto the dense formations of German armor. The inexperienced German crews, hastily trained and completely lacking the integrated combined arms support of the Americans, panicked under the relentless pressure. They attempted to maneuver their heavy tanks out of the kill zones, but their fragile final drives shattered in the soft mud, leaving them immobilized and highly vulnerable. The American Shermans, utilizing their superior speed and mechanical reliability, literally ran rings around the heavier German formations, destroying dozens of Panthers while suffering minimal losses themselves. The Battle of Arracourt proved definitively to the German High Command that the theoretical technical superiority of their heavy tanks was completely meaningless when confronted by the highly integrated, mechanically reliable and aggressively commanded American armored system. The German generals realized with profound despair that they had built the perfect machines to fight the battles of 1941, but they were facing an enemy that had perfected the entire system of mechanized warfare for the realities of 1944. As the war progressed into the bitter winter months, the American armored forces continued to evolve and adapt, compounding the terror they inflicted upon the German defenders. While the standard 75mm gun of the Sherman was sufficient for the majority of combat tasks, the American Ordnance Department rapidly introduced the 76mm high-velocity gun capable of penetrating the frontal armor of the heavier German tanks at standard combat ranges. Furthermore, the introduction of high-velocity armor-piercing or HVAP ammunition utilizing a dense tungsten carbide core provided the American gunners with the localized kinetic energy required to defeat the thickest plates of German steel. The Americans also demonstrated an unparalleled capacity for field improvisation. During the brutal fighting in the Normandy hedgerows, American mechanics welded steel blades scavenged from German beach obstacles to the front of their Sherman tanks, creating the Kulin hedgerow cutter. This simple, ingenious modification allowed the American tanks to physically slice through the massive earthen embankments, completely bypassing the pre-sighted German anti-tank positions and shattering the static defensive lines. This level of bottom-up engineering, driven by the practical problem-solving mindset of the American citizen soldier, was entirely alien to the rigid top-down bureaucracy of the German military machine. The final psychological blow to the elite panzer divisions came during the Battle of the Bulge, where the last massive reserves of the German armored forces were thrown into a desperate winter offensive. The Germans hoped that the harsh weather grounding the American tactical air support and the dense terrain of the Ardennes would neutralize the American advantages in mobility and combined arms. Initially, the surprise attack achieved deep penetrations, but the German commanders quickly encountered the terrifying resilience of the American armored system. Isolated American armored units, rather than panicking and retreating, formed highly effective blocking positions, utilizing the terrain to channel the German columns into massive localized kill zones. The American logistical network, despite being heavily disrupted, continued to push fuel and ammunition to the front lines, while the German offensive literally ground to a halt as their heavy King Tiger and Panther tanks ran out of fuel on the narrow, snowy roads. When the weather finally cleared, the full weight of the American integrated system was unleashed. The tactical air forces returned to the skies, systematically obliterating the stalled German columns, while the American armored divisions, executing massive coordinated counterattacks utilizing their superior radios and massive artillery support, systematically crushed the remnants of the German offensive power. The tactical reality that terrified the German elite panzer divisions was not a single weapon or a specific vehicle. It was the crushing, undeniable realization that they were fighting a society that had turned warfare into a relentlessly efficient, highly mechanized industrial process. They were fighting an enemy whose tanks could communicate instantly, whose artillery was precise and inexhaustible, whose air support was omnipresent, and whose logistical capacity was infinite. The American tank tactics stripped away the romanticism of the armored duel and replaced it with a cold, calculated geometry of destruction. The German commanders, who had spent their entire careers perfecting the art of armored maneuver, found themselves trapped in a terrifying paradigm where their heavy tanks were isolated, outflanked, and obliterated by a swarm of highly reliable machines directed by an invisible network of radio waves and analog computers. The legacy of the United States armored divisions in the European theater remains the ultimate historical testament to the triumph of the integrated combat system over the individual weapon, a triumph that shattered the elite panzer divisions and drove the final nails into the coffin of the German war machine. To further dissect the specific mechanisms of this terror, one must closely examine the symbiotic relationship between the American Sherman tank and the American armored infantryman. The German Panzergrenadier doctrine, while highly advanced on paper, often suffered in execution during the late war period due to severe equipment shortages. German infantry frequently found themselves marching on foot alongside their complex tanks, unable to keep pace with an armored breakthrough. The United States military, by contrast, deployed fully mechanized infantry battalions entirely equipped with M3 armored half-tracks within their armored divisions. This meant that the American infantry could move at the exact same speed as the Sherman tanks, arriving at the critical point of contact simultaneously. When an American armored column engaged a German position, the tanks did not fight alone. The M3 half-tracks would pull up directly behind the advancing Shermans using the massive steel hulls of the tanks as mobile shields. Squads of heavily armed American infantrymen carrying M1 Garand's semi-automatic rifles, Browning automatic rifles, and man-portable bazookas would dismount rapidly, fanning out to protect the vulnerable flanks and rear of the tanks from German close-quarters anti-tank weapons like the Panzerfaust. This level of close coordination was rehearsed relentlessly. The American infantrymen understood the blind spots of the Sherman tank and positioned themselves accordingly, communicating with the tank commander either through hand signals or an external infantry telephone mounted directly on the rear hull of the tank. If a concealed German infantry squad attempted to flank the American armor, the accompanying American infantry would instantly suppress them with a massive volume of semi-automatic fire. Conversely, if the American infantry encountered a heavily fortified German machine gun nest or a concrete pillbox that their small arms could not penetrate, they would simply utilize the external telephone to direct the tank commander's attention to the target. The Sherman would pivot its hydraulically driven turret and obliterate the strongpoint with a single 75mm high-explosive shell. The German defenders, facing this perfectly synchronized combined arms assault, found themselves in an impossible tactical dilemma. If they focused their anti-tank weapons on the Shermans, they would be cut down by the American infantry. If they engaged the infantry, they would be instantly vaporized by the high explosive firepower of the tanks. This seamless integration created an offensive momentum that the disjointed and under-equipped German formations simply could not halt. Another deeply feared aspect of the American armored arsenal was the extensive and highly aggressive use of white phosphorus ammunition, commonly referred to as Willie Pete by the American crews. While originally intended primarily as a smoke-generating round to mask the movement of friendly forces or mark targets for aerial bombardment, American tank gunners quickly discovered its horrifying effectiveness as an offensive weapon against both soft targets and heavy enemy armor. When a 75mm white phosphorus shell detonated, it scattered burning fragments of chemical compound over a wide area. This chemical ignited instantly upon contact with oxygen, burning at intensely high temperatures and producing massive clouds of thick, suffocating white smoke. The burning phosphorus could not be extinguished with water; it simply continued to burn through clothing, equipment, and flesh until the chemical was entirely consumed or deprived of oxygen. When an American Sherman encountered a heavy German Panther or Tiger tank holding a superior defensive position, the American gunner would frequently load a white phosphorus round and fire it directly at the thick frontal armor of the German machine. While the round lacked the kinetic energy to penetrate the armor plate, the resulting explosion enveloped the entire German tank in a cloud of burning chemical and suffocating smoke. The highly active ventilation fans of the German tank, designed to clear the fighting compartment of cordite fumes from the main gun, would instantly suck the dense toxic smoke directly into the crew compartment. The German crew, suddenly blinded and choking violently in the confined space of their tank, would often panic. Believing their vehicle was on fire or simply unable to breathe, they would frequently abandon their incredibly expensive, heavily armored machine, bailing out of the hatches, coughing and gasping for air, only to be immediately cut down by the coaxial machine guns of the advancing American Shermans or the accompanying American mechanized infantry. The psychological dread of the Willie Pete round was immense among the German armored forces. The knowledge that the Americans could neutralize their thickest armor not by penetrating it with steel but by suffocating and blinding the crew with chemical fire added a profound layer of terror to every armored engagement. It was yet another example of the American tactical pragmatism, utilizing every available tool in the inventory to overcome the specific technical advantages of the enemy. This relentless pragmatism was also evident in the aggressive deployment of specialized armored vehicles that operated in direct support of the main Sherman battalions. While the Sherman was the primary instrument of exploitation, the American tactical doctrine relied on dedicated tank destroyer battalions to blunt the heavy German armored counterattacks. These battalions were equipped with highly specialized, highly mobile vehicles like the M10 Wolverine, the M18 Hellcat, and the M36 Jackson. The M18 Hellcat in particular was a mechanical manifestation of the American doctrine of speed and firepower. It was the fastest tracked armored vehicle of the Second World War, capable of reaching speeds approaching 55 miles per hour on paved roads. It possessed incredibly thin armor, essentially providing only protection from small arms fire and shrapnel, but it was armed with a powerful 76mm high-velocity gun housed in a fully rotating open-topped turret. The German armored commanders, accustomed to the heavy lumbering movements of their own tank destroyers like the Jagdpanther or the Elephant, were completely unprepared for the extreme mobility of the American Hellcats. The American tank destroyer doctrine was essentially a massive mechanized ambush strategy. When a German armored thrust was detected, the highly mobile American tank destroyers would race across the battlefield, utilizing the extensive road networks and their superior speed to position themselves on the flanks of the advancing German columns. They would wait in concealed hull-down positions until the heavy German tanks exposed their thinner side armor. The Hellcats would then unleash a devastating volley of high-velocity armor-piercing rounds and immediately utilize their immense speed to relocate to a new firing position before the heavy, slow-traversing turrets of the surviving German tanks could even orient toward the threat. This shoot-and-scoot tactic, executed at extreme speeds, completely unhinged the German armored formations. The German commanders found themselves being engaged from multiple unpredictable angles by an enemy that hit with the force of a heavy tank but moved with the speed of a reconnaissance vehicle. The M36 Jackson, equipped with a massive 90mm anti-aircraft gun modified for anti-tank duties, provided the American forces with the capability to penetrate the frontal armor of even the heaviest German tanks at extended ranges, further stripping away the perceived invulnerability of the elite panzer divisions. As the Allied armies pushed across the Rhine River and into the industrial heartland of Germany during the spring of 1945, the vast, terrifying scale of the American armored system reached its absolute culmination in the envelopment of the Ruhr Pocket. In a massive sweeping maneuver that mirrored the sweeping cavalry tactics of the American Civil War but executed on an unprecedented industrial scale, multiple American armored divisions belonging to the 1st and 9th Armies completely encircled the entire German Army Group B. Over 300,000 German soldiers, including the remnants of several elite panzer divisions, were trapped in an immense pocket of ruined cities and shattered infrastructure. The German commanders attempting to organize a breakout found themselves completely paralyzed by the sheer density and velocity of the American armored presence. Every road was blocked by dug-in Shermans, every radio transmission was intercepted and punished by immediate artillery fire, and the skies were constantly patrolled by swarms of fighter bombers. The American armored forces did not execute a slow grinding siege, they continuously aggressively sliced the pocket into smaller and smaller fragments, utilizing their superior mobility and communication networks to prevent the Germans from ever establishing a coherent defensive line. The entire German command structure collapsed under the relentless pressure, leading to the mass surrender of the entire army group. The encirclement of the Ruhr Pocket was not merely a military victory, it was the final undeniable proof that the American system of mechanized combined arms warfare was the most terrifyingly effective instrument of destruction ever unleashed upon the European continent. It was the ultimate validation of a doctrine that prioritized speed, communication, logistics, and massive integrated firepower over the individual technical specifications of a single heavily armored vehicle. The German elite panzer divisions, born in the Blitzkrieg and forged in the fires of the Eastern Front, were ultimately ground to dust not by a superior tank but by an inescapable, relentless, and perfectly integrated machine of war. The final psychological collapse of the German elite panzer commanders was rooted in a profound sense of strategic despair, a realization that their entire martial philosophy had been rendered obsolete by the American industrial and tactical juggernaut. For a German general, the loss of a Panther or a Tiger tank was a singular tragic event, a permanent reduction in his immediate combat power that could not be replaced for weeks or months, if ever. Every tactical decision he made was shadowed by the agonizing necessity of preserving his irreplaceable heavy machines. He was fighting a war of constant subtraction where every mile of ground defended cost him precious mechanical assets that his dying nation could no longer manufacture. The American commanders, by stark contrast, operated with a mindset of absolute abundance. The United States industrial base, specifically the massive automotive plants of Detroit, functioning completely untouched by enemy bombing, was producing M4 Sherman tanks at a staggering rate of thousands per month. The American logistical network was so incredibly efficient that replacement tanks complete with fresh crews and full ammunition loadouts were often waiting in massive staging areas just miles behind the active front lines. When a German armored battalion fought a desperate, brilliantly executed defensive action and managed to destroy an entire company of American Sherman tanks, the German soldiers might momentarily celebrate their localized tactical victory. But their celebration would turn to cold, creeping horror the very next morning when they looked through their binoculars and saw the exact same American unit advancing across the same field, entirely replenished with brand new tanks, as if the previous day of bloody combat had never even occurred. This endless, inexhaustible supply of American armor broke the will of the German officer corps. They realized that they were attempting to empty the ocean with a teacup. They could execute perfect ambushes, they could utilize the thickest armor, they could leverage the superior ballistics of their 88mm guns, but it simply did not matter. The American system would absorb the losses, seamlessly repair the damaged vehicles, forward the replacements, and continue the relentless offensive pressure without skipping a single operational beat. The terror of the American tank tactics was thus not merely localized to the violence of the immediate engagement, it was the overwhelming existential dread of fighting an enemy that was fundamentally immune to the mathematics of attrition, an adversary that wielded the limitless industrial capacity of an entire continent as the ultimate weapon of war. This is why the German elite panzer divisions, the most feared mechanized formations of their era, were ultimately swept from the battlefield, leaving behind nothing but the burning husks of their over-engineered machines and the shattered remnants of their outdated military doctrines.